Bedford, PA, video tour stop number 6, Fort Bedford.
For this part of the tour, you should be standing right in front of Fort Bedford Museum. Here's what the sign looks like. Now, I warn you, please don't stand along the roadway because there's cars coming up and down there all the time. We just want you to be safe. So make sure you're standing well off the road. As a matter of fact, that's why I'm shooting this video in front of this wall. 1, for safety. 2, I think it makes me look more rugged. Fort Bedford was built in 1758. By the British as part of their campaign against the French during the French-Indian War. Now, during the French-Indian War, the French were very strong in Canada. That was their main stronghold. And they were pushing south into what's now the United States. The British were very strong along the East Coast, eastern Pennsylvania, eastern New York, and New England. And they were pushing westward. The French, pushing south, created a fort called Fort Duquesne in what's now modern-day Pittsburgh by floating a lot of their supplies and heavy artillery down the Allegheny River. They created Fort Duquesne where 3 rivers come together again, now modern-day Pittsburgh. The British were making their way west, and they got as far as about Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, when all of a sudden they encountered a problem. The Allegheny Mountains are a rather daunting feature if you're trying to move heavy artillery. And the Indian paths that the British were able to move west on weren't sufficient to move heavy artillery and supplies. So as a result, the British traveled west, and they traveled with light arms. They were traveling with light arms, and the French had artillery out in the Pittsburgh area. As a result, the French were dominating western Pennsylvania, and the British couldn't defeat them. The British were losing the war. So they decided they had to come up with a secret weapon to defeat the French. And to defeat the French at the one spot they knew where they were at, Fort Duquesne. To do that, the British hired a man named John Forbes. John Forbes was a British officer and an engineer. John Forbes' job was to build a road, quite frankly, from the Chambersburg area all the way over to Fort Duquesne. The idea was this road would allow the British to move heavy artillery into position to attack the French with heavy force. Along this road, the British built several forts. They built Fort Loudon, they built Fort Bedford, and also Fort Ligonier. Now, these 3 forts operated as supply forts that the British massed supplies and men for the final assault on Fort Duquesne. By the time the British completed the road and also the forts, the French, knowing they were going to be outgunned, blew up Fort Duquesne and retreated back to France. Without firing a shot, the British had won the war by massing superior forces, partly here at Fort Bedford. When the French retreated back into Canada, the British moved into that very location. The British took over the spot of Fort Duquesne and built over top of it Fort Pitt, named after a parliamentarian, a big advocate of the war against the French, William Pitt. So if you win the war, they name the city after you, Pittsburgh. If you lose the war, they name the power company after you, Duquesne Power and Light. So the British fort here at Fort Bedford and their campaign against the French, it's a big reason we speak English here in this country today. Because up in Canada, where the French retreated to, they still speak French. After the French-Indian War was over, The British still kept a small force here at Fort Bedford, but it was nowhere near what it was at one time. Instead of thousands, we were down to hundreds or even sometimes dozens. The British kept a presence here, but just a small one at that. Now, the commander at Fort Bedford, he was the law for the area, if you will. The commander was like the Matt Dillon off of Gunsmoke. He was the head honcho of Bedford County. He passed a law, and one of those was, it is illegal to trade weapons with the local Indians. Now, many of the Indians in the area might have been friendly to the white settlers, but some were not. So as a result, many white settlers were killed in this area by hostile Indian attack. So don't trade weapons with the Indians. It happened all the time. Guys from Philadelphia saw an opportunity in this area. The honest ones saw an opportunity to move manufactured goods into the frontier. You want to know why? The British built a road, and that road that was built for military use was now used for commerce by Philadelphia merchants. Philadelphia merchants, in the hub of the manufacturing area, could move manufactured goods west and get them into the frontier now over the British Forbes Trail. Scrupulous businessmen traded honest goods. Unscrupulous businessmen also packed weapons to trade with the Indians at a very high profit. Because you know what? What do you care? You're going back to Philadelphia. Well, the locals knew about this practice going on, and they would complain to the British commander, who never seemed to do anything about it. This particular lack of attention, this particular lack of caring about the people outside the gates of that fort, is what eventually led to the downfall of Fort Bedford. It led to its capture in 1769, and it led to its closing in 1770. And I'll tell you this, Fort Bedford was captured in 1769. If we were Americans in 1769, I would contend to you that the first fort captured in American history was Fort Bedford. The man's name that did it, James Smith. In our next segment, we'll talk about James Smith. So we're going to shut down right here. You can stay right where you're at if you like. You can move inside the fort, and we'll start our next video segment about James Smith, who was in his mid-20s, a handsome young lad, and a guy who liked to wear loincloths. More about that on our next section.